Hi everyone, tough act to follow, but I will definitely try. So for my talk today, I think my focus is going to be more about if you do want to measure your programs or policies, or if you do want to take on a journey of looking at metrics, what are things do you need to think about so that we can find evidence or stories and that we can do more of what is working and less of what is not. So my agenda for today is just I'm going to go over some measurement basics so that we have a common framework of what I mean when I talk about measurement. I'm going to give some basic info or ideas to consider if you're thinking to look at measuring impacts. And then once you do get started, there's a question of how do you make sure the work continues, and that's about the sustainability piece. And I'm just going to wrap up with a case study of a project I was involved in, which really focused on developing metrics. Oh, it's too complicated for me. Okay. So metrics. Metrics are standards of measurement that allow us to look at efficiency, performance, progress, or look at the quality of a plan or a process we have in place. And I can tell you from trying to do a lot of this work within the health field that this is where we get stuck. We get stuck at work, am I going to find the data? How can I look at it? And then just summarizing it and saying this is the knowledge that we have. But really, we really struggle with going into action, into looking at impact, and into thinking of how we can use the data to move forward. And that's really what I hope we can think about a lot more today, is how can we take the data to have insights? Is it because of our work that this happened? What are things that are driving these changes that we can build on? What's wisdom we can take from not only the people looking at the data, but the people who do the work as well? And then really that is about impact and taking action. And so the history of measurement, I'd say, has been pretty consistent across a lot of areas that do community services. One piece we always look at is what did we invest? We have 5 staff. We have this much of a budget. We also tend to look at outputs. So how much did we do? How many people did we see? Oh, yikes. So 200 immigrants visited. And so going back to Anne-Marie's, that would fall under the question of how much did we do. But I think a huge piece is missing here, which she framed as, is anyone better off? And that's really the impact. So what have been the real impact of all this time, all this effort that we've invested? And that's, I think, where we all really struggle. And the immigrant sector is not alone. The health sector really struggles with that as well. Because what we really want, we do all of that for a purpose. Our end is not to see 200 immigrants, but to actually help immigrants get jobs. And so that's the impact piece is what I'm going to be focusing on today. And so every measurement starts off with a purpose, and I can tell you that if you don't think about your purpose before you start, it will really show in the work that you produce. It just won't feel right. You'll feel like you're always putting, what's the word, like a square peg in a circle or whatever that is. So I really think it's important before you do anything to sit down and think of what you want to do. And I'd say that 3 pieces are metrics, methods, and decisions. So metrics is really about what are you going to look at. And how do you identify what metrics you want to think about? And it really is a collaborative approach. My experience has also been that organizations and governments are quite tempted to do a top-down approach, to say, we know what's important and we want you to look at that and measure it. But if you don't talk to staff, if you don't talk to clients, you miss out on a lot. Because you really need to strengthen the metric relevance to client experiences and to frontline work. As an example, when I was working with a community health center, we wanted to look at cancer screening rates. But staff came, and when we talked to staff, they said, what I'm concerned about is a missed care opportunity. And that's when people cancel, or people don't show up, or people have to reschedule and never come. And so that's one piece I never would have thought about if we'd just gone ahead ourselves. We also improved data collection because staff who are often involved in the work will collect it better once they see its relevance. It's also a great opportunity to educate them because data is really everyone's job nowadays. And then this is really important is we'll have very big dreams on what we want to look at and what we want to measure, but it's really important to kind of scale it back and think about what can we do given our data, and even when we have the data, can we even pull it in a way that we can use? And for those two pieces, I really think we need to include the data persons, if I want to call them that, or IT persons. Sometimes that's not their job, but that's what they've been exposed to and what they do, so you really need to bring them on board. So let's say you've kind of sat down and you've decided what you want to look at. I think it's really important to look at the scope of the types of performance we can look at. One is access, so who is accessing, or more importantly, probably not accessing our services. So the percentage of immigrants who came to see you about employment. Once they get here, how's the delivery? Do different immigrant groups have different experiences of your services? What are their satisfaction rates? Are we able to reach certain groups more than others? And then there's the outcomes. So how are they doing in the end? So how many, what's the unemployment rate or the employment rate? And then what's happening once we implement a service in comparison to people who never got that service, for example. And so I just did want to stop 1 minute at looking at satisfaction because, again, healthcare and so many services sectors, that's really where they stop at when it comes to outcomes. And it really is because that data seems a lot easier to get, but I think we really need to move forward and past that. So opportunities it tends to be really low-hanging fruit. It gives us a lot. It tells us a lot about issues we might be having and how we need to move forward. It helps us be accountable. But I can tell you also from experience that there are a lot of limitations. We really don't know if people are happy with the service, but is it really helping them? What are we have a lot of data quality concerns that come up around who is participating, who isn't, what are barriers to that, and we don't always define that well. So while I think satisfaction is really critical, I want us to push beyond looking at satisfaction as well. So I've talked a bit around engaging people, looking at type, but I'm going to be very quantitative today, and I'm going to really invite you to think about the qualitative pieces, because the stories you'll get from clients and staff will be hugely enlightening. Then there's the methods of how you can look at those metrics. And so data access, like I said before, is such a huge barrier. And I think there are some things we can do to address that. At the organizational levels, I really encourage organizations to try to find a way to collect their own data. Because if you want something done well, you do it yourself. And so we need to invest in also collecting demographic data, because I see in health and in immigration and other fields, we don't talk about the differential experiences of people. If you're a visibly racialized immigrant, if you don't speak English, if you're Muslim, there's a lot of factors that will make your experience as an immigrant very different from another immigrant. And so the type of data we collect really needs to be able to dive deep into that. We also want to link outcomes to individual level variables. What I mean by that is a lot of times we're tempted to collect data anonymously, but that really doesn't help us, because then we can't go back and link it to different clients, to information about clients, or to track their journey. And so I really encourage you to have linkable data. And if you already report some data externally to governments or funders, then you have a pot of gold. That's data you're already collecting, that's already there, and you should really use that. At the community level, you can leverage a lot of that organizational data being collected. If you're not alone, if other people are collecting, that's a great opportunity for you to come together. And then you can use administrative databases, such as the Institute for Clinical and Evaluative Sciences. Just one note, if you do collect your own data, it's really critical you think about the privacy of that data and de-identification principles. I won't get into that, but I think that's a pretty important disclaimer. The Institute of Clinical and Evaluative Services, ICES, is really interested in immigration data. They've been looking at it, mining it, looking at how the linkages that they can make to health, and you can do the other way around. As people interested in immigration, you can then tap into their data around health. And I'll show you some of the infographics they have up there. If you go to their website, they have a lot on immigration that they've been able to start looking into because of more improvements in how the federal government links data sets. The other piece I wanted to to just make a note on is we have to move beyond just comparing averages, because that tends to be quite misleading. I just gave you here a mock example. Let's say you're looking at time to find a family physician. As an immigrant myself, I can tell you that was a huge nightmare. And if you look at people who visited a settlement agency versus not, I'll give you an example of the number of days people had to wait. So if you look at the top one, it seems chaotic. You can sense something is going on, but you're not sure what. While the one for people who'd visited, it's quite consistent. So it's actually telling you that chances are something's working there. So we need to move beyond just looking at averages and taking tests that can look at that variation. And it's actually not that hard to do once you get into it. And this is probably one of the most important pieces I wanted to cover today, which is causality. We can introduce policies and programs, but how can we know, like I said, what is working and what is not? Is it what we've done that's really empowered immigrants or helped with their integration? And there's really 3 approaches for us to look at causality. So experimental design, quasi, and non-experimental. And I'm just going to take this one example as I go through the 3 of them. Let's say we want to evaluate the impact of a mental health support service or a policy on immigrants' well-being. So it's experimental design. It's where we have clients and we totally randomly, for no reason, it's total randomness, we put them into different groups. That's really the gold standard in establishing causality, because then we assume that they're going to go through the same conditions, through the same circumstances, and so any difference between both is going to be purely only due to our intervention. So the pros are the reliability and the quality. The cons is it's really hard to ensure total random assignment in the real world. When we want to really help as many people as possible, it's costly. There are ethics. To give you an example, we'd randomly assign people into the old mental health support program we had, the new or the known. So you can imagine it would be really hard to do the third one, and it would raise a lot of ethical concerns. And so sometimes we'll then land on what we call the quasi-experimental design. And that's really common in what I call the real world. We don't have a lot of controls into which assignments we can do, but we can do a lot to really ensure our comparison groups are as similar as possible, or we can really sit down and reflect what are other impacts that might be happening, or that might be changing how people are experiencing our programs, and try to incorporate that. So it's adaptable. It does require vigilance in setting it up, and it can be argued that evidence is less reliable, but it's actually really good to have when we can't do random assignment. So one example is, I'm sure you have waitlists for certain services. You can just compare people on the waitlist, so people actually getting the service. Or you can compare regions if it's more of a policy between cities. Then there's a non-experimental, which again looks at changes. That's really important to track that, to look at causality. It's practical, very straightforward, but it can be hard to be very confident in saying that the policy has had a direct impact. So those are 2 examples, though, of how we can do that. Just compare people's well-being before and after a service, or do time series, do a comparison in the middle of the program as well, and that's really encouraged when possible. So I've talked about the methods. So we have to decide on data elements and the source. I talked about methods of measurement, especially around causality. And so can you add a qualitative component? Oh, I thought that was in metrics as well. So I think, again, I'm really going to talk about quantitative, but I do not believe in the superiority of the quantitative data. I feel like qualitative can add a lot of meaning. Perfect, thank you. And so once you've decided on the metrics, you've done the data analysis, what decisions are you going to make? The evaluation is not the end, and I see that happening too. It's so much work by the time you do the evaluation that ends up being the result of all your work, and that's where you stop. But we really need to go beyond and revisit our metrics often. I know I have in a lot of my work. And then do you have a communication plan? Staff feel quite upset, and really rightly so, when they get so involved in helping us develop metrics and do analysis and do data collection, but never know what happens. And so if you do your own data collection, a question, you'll be like, why are we doing this? What's going to happen because of it? And so it's really important for you to figure out how to engage staff around that. And so you've started the work, you've done the evaluation. My experience has been within a year, things start to really drop off because people have moved on to other priorities. And so how do you build the sustainability of this type of work? I think the first piece is to really demystify the scariness of data. I used to just say the word average, and people are like making me pause, and they want to take notes on what that is. It's so hard not to feel so overwhelmed by the idea of data, but it's actually, once people go through it a bit by bit, I've seen people come from, I don't even know the difference between missing data and someone saying do not know, to actually wanting to do chi-squares. I don't know if anyone here knows chi-squares, but I've seen a lot of change. People are really excited. So we want to engage clients on the whys of measurement, because they really need to find meaning in a lot of that data work. We want to provide opportunities for additional training. And a project where I did around developing metrics, it was totally unplanned for, but we ended up doing 3 webinars because staff were calling to say, please, I want to find out more, tell me more about how I can do this. And so there's really the thirst for it. We just need to make sure we need to meet that. I also want to support an evaluation that involves everyone. Measurement doesn't happen in isolation. I say historically, IT worked on their own and data people worked on their own, but that's really no longer the reality of how we need to do metrics and measurement. And so we need to include everyone from clients, the staff, to upper leadership and management. And we really want to set up opportunities to get input and share lessons. I've learned so much from talking to frontline staff and clients, and we often find that the goals of clients do not align with the goals of people providing services. And I think maybe a good example would be for you, integration is a big goal. But if someone's just coming to get a job, and my research with immigrants really shows I just want a job, then how are we developing metrics that are meaningful for them as well? And so finally, to keep that knowledge accessible and transparent so everyone knows how we're doing. And then finally, it's all in the details. Don't just be broad in your statements of success. I've really become passionate about the idea we have to look at the positive and the negative impacts of our work, both intended and unintended. To give you an idea, in one group I did, people wanted to do, they wanted to limit the number of fast food areas in this one very highly racialized community with a lot of immigrants, and the policymaker from the city said that will encourage them to eat better. So I think I can see their rationale, but what's an unintended consequence? Now they probably have nowhere to go get food. And if you do that without addressing that it's a food desert, that they actually have nowhere to buy anything, and even if you do, how much time does it take to go and then buy groceries and then make food? And so a lot of the times when we develop policies and programs, we do not at all think about the unintended negative consequences. And so it's really important we look at that, because once we know what they are, we can really work on ameliorating them. And so I'll just wrap up with a case study of something. This is something I did around 7 years ago. And within downtown Toronto, community health centers and hospitals were interested in developing metrics to find out how are they doing on equity, are people getting the services that they need, are certain communities being excluded from certain healthcare services, but they didn't know how to do it. And so what we came in, and so at the time they're called the LINS, the Regional Health Authority, funded a team. It's a knowledge translation team. It was me and 2 other people to really do this across the city. It was for 32 organizations. And so we did everything. We did the training, we did workshop, we did a lot of KT. I myself talked to people about data. We did a lot of engagement, consultations, IT consultations. Anyone who's tried to build anything into their IT systems knows that it can be a bit of a nightmare. But once you bring people together, really great solutions start coming up. And so, I'm almost done. Okay. And so we came all together as a KT team, and it took us 2 years longer than we thought it would, but really it ended up being such a rewarding experience, because now within downtown Toronto, we have the first regional health authority in Canada who have a standardized approach to looking at health equity data. If you can believe it, before this, hospitals had, I'd say maybe 5 years ago, if you went to a hospital, they could not tell you who they served. They had some OHIP data, but that was about it. But this, I think, really shows the power of data and how it can totally change how you understand your clients, but also the power of just having a few people who have the exact type of knowledge you need, really try to expand it, because communities of practice can sometimes be tricky, but in this case, it really did such a good job. So I really encourage everyone here to think about how we can get together and do do measurement and look at metrics, because it can really change the way that you do work. So these are just my references, and thank you.